Welcome, everyone. It's a very special episode of the Buck Stops here, and I'm Kirk Buchner. I own NotInHallOfFame.com and the sister site, the United States Athletics Hall of Fame. Look for some big news on that shortly. And we're recording this the day after, and 2 days before the Super Bowl, but the day after the NFL Honors, which had the Pro Football Hall of Fame announcement. And I don't want to say we told you so, but we told you so. And have with me today is Paul Lawrence, the first person who said, I told you so, our little football group, because you saw this coming a mile away.
Well, I think we need to give due credit to our very good friend and our colleague, Jack Silverstein, because he did the math on this and he's been hammering this point publicly for months and actually, making some even the voters aware what
One
we
in
were facing.
particular, but yes.
Yeah, and he ran the numbers and he's been a strong, I guess, advocate, if you want to call it, to remind people the rules are different and we're going to see a class that we have not seen in terms of the size. We're getting that in a minute, but
Yeah.
yeah, we saw it last night, or the outcome certainly.
Yeah. And before we sort of go into the results, there might be some people who are watching this for the first time or sort of like discovering this channel. If you could go over, and I know you've done this before on a previous show, what the new rules were for the Pro Football Hall of Fame and how we got here.
All right, so everybody get their pen and pencil out and their paper. If you're good at math, and I'll try to kind of keep this distill it to the basics. But in years past, right, we would have a process where we would end up with a series of senior finalists, and then in some years we had coaches, contributors, and then they would be narrowed down, and we would see as many as three seniors or one or two coaches and contributors. And on the modern side, it hasn't really changed a lot over the decades.
Hmm.
We would get down to 15 finalists, and then they would vote, and they would meet, discuss all 15, vote down to 10, and then vote down to 5. And then at 5, it was like thumbs up or thumbs down. If they got 80% of the last 5, they're in. Easy peasy, been like that for decades. But yes, after some criticism from people like Deion Sanders and some other Hall of Famers, people in the media, they're like, we were seeing classes of 7, 8, 9 2 years ago. And then, of course, the Centennial class was special in 2020. There were 20. So there has been this kind of shift in the winds, that might be, of some pretty vocal, publicly, Deion Sanders primarily, and also I'm sure behind the scenes to the hall management and directly to the board to say, wait a minute, these classes are we're watering down the honor, we're letting in too many people, and that caused a shift that kind of caught a lot of people by surprise, including many of the 49 selectors. There should be 50, but there's an absent seat. Last summer, when they weren't informed, but the hall announced we're going to change the entire process for this election cycle for the class of 2025. So yeah, in our previous shows, we've been working through this the last several months, where we started with hundreds of candidates, and then we went down to 100 or so semifinalists across these categories, and down to about 50 finalists, and then we had the results last night. But the rules changed, so that we grouped the senior, coach, and contributors. There's 5 finalists that could be taken to the election meeting, and only 3 of them could get in, and they had to have the 80%. So if you do the math and you have 49 voters with 5 votes, you can quickly figure out, and they need 40 votes to get in, that it's not going to mean that we're going to see all 3, even though that's what would be allowed as the maximum. Just because of the way the math works, you're splitting
Right.
votes among all these 49. On the modern side is even a little more wacky, because yes, we went from 15 to 10 when they met last month and had the meeting. They started with the 15 finalists, they vote down to 10. Then they voted down to 7. And at that point, they were given a ballot, say, okay, pick 5. And they weren't, they didn't know the counts or results of all this, but you end up, again, with the math of having 49 voters, having 5 names to put on the ballot to choose from 7. Yeah, we could get a guy who might get, say, 40, 41, 42 votes, and they're in. But vote splitting across 7 might mean you could have 2 or 3 guys who get, let's say, 33, 34, 29, and suddenly the votes get eaten up, but those vote totals aren't 80%. So even though it seems like the rules say a maximum of 5, when you run the math and the scenarios, we suddenly realized over the last several months that we could be seeing 4 moderns only, maybe 3 moderns.
And that's what we
But
got.
we didn't really know until
Yep.
last night.
Yep. And that's exactly what we got. I don't know if I passed or flunked algebra, but either way, good thing I'm a public figure. I don't have to pass this stuff. Actually, Google it, kids. I really am. I don't know how, but it happened.
Yeah, and that means you have minions that do your math now.
Or you'd think so, right? No, I got nobody. So this is exactly what we got. So we only had 3 people go through, and 3 deserving candidates, of
As
course.
moderns, yep.
Yep, 3 moderns. Yeah, we'll look at those first.
Sure.
Eric Allen, Jared Allen, and Antonio Gates. I don't know if there's a whole lot we need to go through with Antonio Gates. I think a lot of us, put myself in that category, thought that he had the resume of a first ballot Hall of Famer. I'm happy he's in. Jared, yeah, actually, before we go into the other ones, I want your take on Gates. Happy, like,
yeah, I mean,
right?
you and I in our group and others who follow the Hall,
Yeah.
I think shared the same view that we were shocked he didn't get in as a first ballot last year. I mean, he's considered among the top 2 of his era tight ends. Some would argue top 10 all-time tight end. He still holds the NFL career record for touchdowns by a tight end. You know, he had all-decade team, has the first team All-Pro, didn't win a championship, but all of it, you know, as we talk about, he checked all the boxes. I think he just got squeezed out a little bit last year in terms of, well, you know, this sort of it doesn't exist, but there's a first ballot kind of barrier. It's not anything official, but voters tend to look at that, some of them anyways. And he probably just missed out by a little bit.
To be honest, Paul, if I was a voter, so would I. But I would have had him on the other side.
Yeah.
But yeah.
So fair, you know, but certainly last year, a year ago, he was probably the most controversial aspect of the results a year ago for a guy who was left off. So yeah, kudos to him. And you know, as we move through the rest of these 3, I think maybe we should let me know, as much as we're going to criticize the outcome and the process and talk a lot about that here. Congratulations to all 4 of these guys. They're all deserved. We're going to go through each one of them, and nothing that we're going to talk about in terms of our criticism of the process and outcome is directed, because I think all of us and many of us who work in our group and consult, I think the consensus is we might have had a few differences of the order here, but I think for the most part, people are quite pleased that these 4 are all deserving. As you're going to hear, we think the process should allow for a few more, but. Absolutely. So that's Gates, yeah. Great addition to the Hall of Fame. Congratulations.
Jared Allen, it almost felt like he was due, like he was the next one up. He was enters on his 5th year, finalist every single year that he's been eligible. One of the best pass rushers of all time. I mean, there are some criticisms, as our group has sort of looked at, might be a little one-dimensional in his play, but if you're going to have a dimension, pass rushing is a pretty damn good one.
Yeah.
You know, 2-time sack leader, 1-time tackle for loss leader, high in those categories. Allen felt due in a weird way, even though there are other people who were more due. But I really was not surprised by this at all. Sam?
No, I don't think a lot of us were, because for many of the reasons you just described, he's been a finalist. We've seen him play out in terms of, we talk about the queue, players get in as a 15 finalist. It takes them a few years to work through the levels, but you can see the voters are advancing him in the process. You know, in the past, it would be from the 15 to the 10 to the 5. I described that earlier. And he's been in that mix. And the Hall has, in the last decade, they've elected a lot of pass rushers. Some of them we would characterize as pure pass rushers, either outside linebacker or defensive end. So there's also been a pass rushing queue to this thing. Right. But yeah, we might quibble a little bit. And the fact that he's weighted, right, kind of reflects what you're pointing out, is there's a few weaknesses in that resume, but it's strong enough that he wasn't going to go away. And as you mentioned, that many years as a finalist, the voters get to be aware, they're waiting, and then they look for an opening, and they obviously found one this year, and then moved him in. So fair enough.
Well, the person I'm happiest for the most, by far, is Eric Allen, and it's not even close. You mentioned our friend Jack. Jack has sort of changed a lot of my thinking in terms of like I used to think when I started this whole process, I always thought, okay, whoever is the best five, I don't care of their years of eligibility. And Jack has sort of altered my perception on that a little bit by, if we've got somebody qualified who's been on the ballot for, in Eric Allen's case, 19 years,
Yeah.
let's get him in, even if he might not be as qualified as player X, whoever that might be. You know, uh, Allen certainly has the credentials, 6 Pro Bowls, 54 interceptions. Would terrify me if I was an offensive coordinator. And he's finally got his due.
Yeah, I mean, we've talked about this balance where we see people move in this process, their first ballot, they get quickly moved through and they get
Mhm.
elected in a year or two. But we also have, yeah, we have this group of players, and many of us in your work on that we do in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, we've kind of started to highlight, and you mentioned folks like Jack and others have said, wait a minute, there are some guys here that are kind of being forgotten. They haven't moved up, they haven't even become among the 25 semifinalists, let alone one of the 15 finalists, and they can sit there for years and not really get recognized. And suddenly, they're eligible for 20 years. There's a waiting period of 5 years. They're eligible as a modern for 20 years can go by. And when they aren't really moving forward and are going to quickly be forgotten. Now, fortunately, unlike Albert Lewis from a few years ago, who suddenly got recognized by the voters and they tried to move quickly to get him into the process, and he didn't make it in his final year as a finalist in the final 10, but he didn't get elected. That needs to happen a bit sooner. So, yeah, it was good to see in the case of Eric Allen, and there are a few more on the ballot we're going to talk about perhaps that are still in that kind of situation that they do get recognized. And they need to get in that final 15, folks, because that's where they're presented and discussed. When they're a preliminary member, 100 plus, 50 plus, or a semifinalist, that's all mail-in ballot. There's really no debate or discussion. So the key thing is to get a guy like Aaron Allen in the process, moving along, and get him in as a finalist. He's been a finalist now for a couple of years, because
Second, I believe.
next year
Second.
is his last year as a modern finalist, and you fall out of that into the senior pool, and good luck getting out of there because it's deep and
We've seen.
there's harder. It's harder. Just the numbers just are just brutal for those guys. So he's a good example of a player who deserved to be considered. Got the voters pushed him through, talked about him, and let's not hang him out there to dry if we wait too long. Let's get him elected. And he has all the credentials, so we're not going to argue. So it's good to see that type of, I guess, timeline for a player to finally get in and get elected.
Yeah. So before I go to the next part, because I want to look at the ones who we'll save Sharpe for later because I want to look at the seniors separately if that's okay.
Fair enough. Yep.
Yeah. I want to sort of like do a shout out, and I did that on X. I want to do that here publicly. Clark Judge, thank you so much for lifting as much of the curtain as you're allowed to do. Um, I posted this on X, and he posted it, which meant a lot to me. That because and that's no joke. I look forward to his column after this comes out with bated breath the most. That is the one I can't wait to read. It's the one. It's like this will sound so corny, but I'm a wrestling fan, right? So I just got excited about the Royal Rumble.
Mm.
Right, like that's my favorite show to watch in wrestling. And then a week later, it's not necessarily who gets in. I want to hear
Yeah.
as much as I can about that. Clark, thank you so much. You are a joy to read. All your work is respected and loved by myself. I know my group of people, and it means a lot to us. So I just
Yeah,
wanted.
and I think for a lot of us, and maybe people who are interested enough in this, they're actually watching this,
Yeah.
that for many, many years, you didn't get a peek behind the curtain. You didn't know what was going on. These meetings are private, they're not public. The vote counts are never made public.
Right.
So for many years, it would just be announced. They turned it into more of a production in the last decade or so. But along with Peter King and the late Dr. Z, who wrote for Sports Illustrated, they kind of opened the current a little bit in the 90s and early 2000s. But you're right, in social media now, on Twitter and some other platforms in the last several years, Clark, as an active voter, has in his work on the Talk of Fame webpage and his podcast and all that work with his colleagues, John Turney, and now we've got voters like Tony Graza from Cleveland
Yeah,
and
thank
Frank
you for
Cooney
forwarding that off to me.
on Substack, that they're also starting to kind of pull that curtain even opener for us. The hall has rules about what the voters can and cannot say publicly. They can't get into specifics of debates. They can't talk about, they're allowed if they choose to say, hey, I voted for these guys. They can make that after the fact. But yeah, kudos to them because it does give us some insight a little bit in terms of how this plays out. And I think it's had an influence on the hall because their press releases and their events used to be pretty basic for this. And now they ramped that up and they're
Yeah.
actually giving us a bit more of the results and a bit more than we used to. But it is great. It gives us a little bit of a window, and thank to Clark and all the other voters and the people in the media who are reporting on some of this a little more than just announcing, hey, here's who was elected, here's their profiles. We
Mhm.
know all that. But little things like in the last number of years, we've started to find out who made the final 10, who made the final five this year, the final seven.
Before the final 50, we didn't even have that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, the hall did
After the
change all
hall.
that. We
Yeah.
never used to see the final fifth, they introduced, we see the preliminary and then the 25, but they introduced a non-voting panel to come up with the 50 semifinalists. And then they, refine that. We're getting much more of that. And you're right. It's great to hear. I saw a few of them posted after the announcement last night, including Clark's. Because you're right. We get a little bit of insight, a little bit of a thought about what the thinking was, not the details and not pointing out debates and who said what said and who voted for whom. That kind of stuff isn't known. The voters don't even know actually what the results are. They just hand in their ballots and they don't know who said what or what the numbers were. We'll
Mhm.
never know any of that. But it helps and it's interesting perspective. And so, like for example, we knew there was obviously 15 of these modern finalists. So we found out that there were a group of players that we're talking about no more detail in a minute, but Eli Manning and Stephen Smith and Scruggs and Fred Taylor, Reggie Wayne, they didn't advance
Well, so
beyond
yeah, let's
the
look at that.
yeah,
'Cause-
okay. So that this is the group that so we have the 15. The first
yeah.
cut down goes from 15 to 10. So
Mhm.
you've got five guys who are going to be set aside by the voters. They didn't get enough votes to advance. So this year of the 15, that group of five who were eliminated in the first round of balloting at the meeting a month ago, Zoom meeting of the 49 selectors, was Eli Manning, Stephen Smith Sr., Terrell Sluggs, Reggie Wayne, and Fred Taylor.
Which, when you look at that initial five, obviously, as Clark pointed out, and he didn't, if he didn't, I mean, like, he didn't have to. We all sort of knew the biggest name going into it for a lot of people was Eli. Eli now will combat somebody much bigger
Yeah.
through Brees. I don't have to say that as a Saints fan, guys.
Yep.
I think that's a given that he's now no longer the best quarterback. I don't know what he was before, but eligible for the Pro Football Hall of Fame. Uh, you mentioned Fred Taylor. Frank Gore's up next, right?
Yeah, so we're getting a minute. Yeah, in the 2026
Yeah.
class of first ballot, there's a lot of big names in it that are going to really fight for these slots a year from now. So the returning semifinalists and finalists, including the five we just mentioned here,
Yeah.
some of them are going to have a tough time making it to the same stage of the final 15 a year from now because of some of the names. We're getting this in a minute about who those are, but and then of course every year after that, I got a few names I'll throw out here. This only gets harder if you're not moving forward. But every year with the 15, there's going to be guys who are going to be set aside in the early stages of voting. They have to wait. And the names we just mentioned, I don't think for a lot of us, I mean, their supporters and fan bases would scream that, Steve Smith or Fred Taylor or Reggie Wayne should be in, and that's fair enough. But from us who look at the broad view, I don't think a lot of this surprises they were
Right.
the first group out, except for the name that you mentioned. And that is, of course,
Well,
infamous
yeah.
Eli
Well,
Manning,
sure.
which, myself and others pointed out 5 years ago when he retired. There were voters who were publicly, 5 years ago and ever since then, publicly commenting that his Hall of Fame resume has some holes to it, which we can get into if people are interested. And we've talked about him before, I think, enough to people to realize there's some, yes, he's a two-time Super Bowl winner, MVP of that game, and beating the Patriots, included what was then the undefeated team. So yeah, there's some credentials there. That's why he's on the 15 finalist list. Maybe some, like our friend Jack and others, would think even that was premature, but it is what it is. And you're right that later when we work through, we're talking the next few years, him and the others are gonna have a tough time. The competition as we add new players is only gonna get harder.
especially in wide receivers.
Yeah.
But I think we'll talk a bit more once we get to the final seven. So if you can, the three people who got cut from 10 to 7.
Yeah, so this is the difference, right? You used to cut down to 5. This year they add that wrinkle, they cut it down to 7.
Right.
So the guys that are in the three that are in that next stage are Darren Woodson and the two guards, one of whom you're quite a big fan of,
Sorry, Evans,
Jared Evans, and then Mastriata. They're in that 3. Now, okay, so Woodson's been on the ballot for a while. He's been in the final 10 a couple times, so he's in that kind of queue. He has the support of voters. I think the fact that him and Eric Allen were on the same ballot probably drew some split votes. And as we mentioned, Eric Allen's eligibility as a modern ends next year. Woodson actually has 3 more years. So it's going to be tight because of what we're going to get into in the numbers here, but at least he has a path, which is good, and not really an immediate competition at the position, so to speak. And then you have the two guards, who I think a lot of us, and to have two guards, one in their first year and one in their second year in the ballot, to get this far is impressive, only because the voters tend to be very selective and, in my view, a little bit harsh on the guard position. I've talked many times about Alan Faneca having to wait several years to be elected. The guy made like 7 or 8 all first team All Pro and all decade. But at any rate, I guess the point here is to have 2 of them make that round is good. They're going to compete against one another, but they're early in their eligibility, 1 or 2 years in. They're well situated. It may take several years to get both of them in, but they're not going to be surpassed by a peer until Zach Martin reaches the ballot, and that's still several years down the road. So they're in good shape. So I think that bodes very well for them to be at this stage, to kind of set themselves up in the queue. And that's just positive to see, because sometimes guards can sit in that 11 to 15 queue for a while. So good for them. It's a solid group of 3.
Oh, absolutely. And so as we get to the final 7, now maybe I missed this. So I'm going to ask you this: the 4 who did not advance, or did not get elected, rather, they said on the press release that they will automatically be finalists in 2026. Did I miss this?
Well, I'd have to go back and look at the new bylaw, the election bylaws.
Yeah.
I do recall now. I think that the language is in there on that, which we've not had before. Before, you kind of start the slate all clean. The next year, you go through the whole process. You're not guaranteed, if you were in the final 15 or the final 10 or whatever in one year, that you would advance through the process the next year. However, we use the term the queue, and the queue does exist. The voters know these guys. And so if you make it, especially to the final 10, or in this case, the 7, it's very unlikely that you're going to fall off that queue and not be in at least the final 15 next year. But they've created this, I guess, kind of an off-ramp, kind of acknowledging, hey, you made it to the final 7. You were on that ballot in this year's new rules, where you were among the ones that voters could choose to elect, a minimum of 3, a maximum of 5 to get the 80%. So we're going to give you a little bit of a, I don't know, a ribbon or a consolation award that we're going to put you automatically in. The names we're going to talk about in that group, I suspect, would have been in the final 15 next year.
Are they among 15, or they're going to have 15 on top of that?
No, they're guaranteed a slot in the 15.
Okay, so basically, the 25 semifinalists there's only 11 who are going to get through, for sure. Because I just wanted to make sure I was reading that correctly.
I don't know about that, how the mechanics. Well, that must be how the mechanic. If they're guaranteeing these folks a slot in the 15, yeah, it means that when they do the cut down lot next year from the 25 down, they won't be picking 15. They'll be picking,
I guess, 11.
11, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because I wasn't sure because I kept reading that over and over again, and my useless English degree.
Well, and again, I mean, this is the first time that that kind of mechanism has been triggered in the election process. And yeah, I think the mechanics of it, like you just mentioned,
Hmm.
we'll have to see how that plays out. But if you're guaranteeing somebody a slot in the 15, and that's what they said, not in addition to the 15, but in the 15, then yeah, the countdown is the count cut down, excuse me, is
Yeah.
going to be a little bit different from 25 to 11 a year from now.
Well, so advancing, we've got Willie Anderson, and I didn't even realize this yesterday. I tweeted something, right, and it was like, "We told you so." Da 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 da. One of the persons who responded to me was Willie Anderson. Who was saying, "Yeah," saying it's going to take a long time. It's like that should have ticked me off. Oh, he's not getting in. But I had so many things on my plate, I didn't even put that together until I woke up this morning. Woke up this morning and just how did I not react more impactful? And when did he start following me?
Well, let's hope you don't get an unmarked package in the mail the next couple of days.
Well, from him, no. I mean, obviously he agreed with what I said.
Well,
Yeah,
and I give a lot of credit to all these guys. I mean,
yeah.
it takes a lot of patience and a lot of, you know, you really have to have the right approach and demeanor to realize I didn't get in, but you know, being bitter and angry vocally about it publicly probably doesn't do him any good.
Oh, no,
So I give him kudos because he did respond actually even before the election results were announced last night from New Orleans at the NFL Honor Show. He actually tweeted earlier today, kind of a careful, vague, but kind of like I'm not going to paraphrase, kind of like this is well, there's always next year. He said something like that, so we kind of knew
yeah.
he wasn't going to be get elected, and I think he's been on that ballot, he's moved forward, he's in that queue, and I think he's in good shape in the coming years. There's been some debate among our group about his case and resume, but obviously it resonates with the voters. And that to get
Right.
that far, from hundreds of people back in September that were preliminary to make it to the final seven as a modern is a significant accomplishment. And
Mhm.
he's got lots of time left on the ballot, I believe, at least several years. I think so. But
Yeah, he's got some time.
that's time. So he'll make his way through.
There's Luke Kuechly, who I thought was he was I had him ranked number one as all for anyone who's eligible. Didn't get in. He will eventually. I'm not too worried about him at this point. If like he's
Yeah, I think there's really, again, when you get to this level, any little hole or ding in your resume kind of gets amplified because it's almost like the voters have to find a reason not to vote for you, right? Because they've
right.
got only vote for so many other, it's that kind of debate. And in his case, it's really two things.
Short
Uh,
career.
Short career, right? And people go, wait a minute, you got your Gale Sayers, you got your Dick Buckus. Okay, no offense to Luke Kuechly, but he's not a Gale Sayers and he's not a Dick Buckus. And then people say, well, what about a Tony Basella and a Kenny Easley and Patrick Willis and a few and Trell Davis?
Mhm.
Well, it's worth
All either
reminding
way.
they all got in, but guess what? None of them were first ballot. In fact, Ken Easley had to get in through a senior route, and they had careers that were 9 years or so.
Yeah, yeah.
Uh, Kuechly has 8 years. That's a short career, and I'll tell you what, the fact that he got this far does speak to the high quality of the years he played. He checks all those boxes. He didn't win a Super Bowl, but otherwise, I mean, multi All Pro, the All Decade, Defensive Player of the Year, Defensive Rookie of the Year. He's got all that. Now, his counterpart, Patrick Willis, who was elected a few years ago, has a very similar resume and a shorter
Classic.
career, but it took him
Yeah,
3 or 4 years to get in.
yeah.
I don't think Luke is going to wait more than a couple more years.
I agree. Next year will be tough, but yeah, we'll see. Adam Vinatieri, Adam, I
I
trust.
thought he was your top guy.
Well, no, he was my presentation. I
Yes, you gave a fantastic presentation when our group did our own
Yeah.
parallel exercise.
Didn't get him
And I
into
think
that one
we all
either.
figured that you got Adam Vinatieri elected from our group. So kudos to that.
Uh, I went by emotion. I channeled Jack's Devin Hester.
Yes.
Okay.
Emotion can play a big role. I'm sure it does in these meetings if people are passionate about what they're saying and can present it. Emotion. This is a humans are voting, and emotion can be a factor, no
Absolutely.
doubt.
But yeah, the only person, as I said on my presentation, only one who's a member of the 100th anniversary team. I don't care what position you are. That's
Yeah.
goddamn impressive. But he's still here. I think it's a little bit off that Stenerud got in first ballot. He doesn't. Whatever. We know he's going to get in eventually. I think maybe next year.
Oh yeah, I mean he's just sort of like the Luke Kuechly situation, right?
Yeah.
Again, if you use the analogy of the flaws or holes in the resume, Vinatieri has very few, except for he's a kicker, and there's just
Right.
again, think of this process, people. We're asking 49 people to vote down to 7 to 5, and you need 80%. You're going to need to convince 40 of those 49 or so to pick you. That only means it only takes 10 voters to check, I don't know, Holt or Anderson or Woodson or Evans or whatever, somebody else's name off,
Right.
and you could be top 5, but you didn't get elected for reasons we're going to talk about in a second. And it's not so much your qualifications or anything, and he's a first ballot. This is the second year in a row, by the way, we've had no first ballot elected, which is counter to a trend for several years that led to a lot of criticism by voters and in the media that too many first ballot. We were getting classes with 5 moderns that might have 2 or 3 first ballot. So that's kind of an interesting shift that I
Interesting.
don't think really surprised us because Luke's career was short and because Vinatieri is a kicker that got those little dings in the resume that would hold them back. But you're absolutely right. He's not going to wait very long. He's going to get in. He has no competition on the ballot coming in. He has a clear path to election, and he came this close.
Well, here's someone who's in the opposite scenario. Uh, Someone who does have now somebody better coming in his position. That's Tory Holt. I guess I got fooled by Isaac Bruce's tweet, like we all did. Because
Hey guys, knock it off with the implying that you're in New Orleans to help your teammate or your friend and you're there to support him because he got elected. Don't stop trying to insinuate that in the
that's
days
what I
leading
got
up.
out of it. That's what you got out of it.
Yeah.
I thought, great. I mean, I've been a big fan of Tory Holt for a long time. No disrespect to Isaac Bruce. I actually had Holt higher than Bruce personally.
Yeah, yeah. I've heard others say the same. It's a fair point.
But now here he is. What is this seventh, eighth time that he's been a finalist?
Yeah.
So
And he's been in the final 10 now, I think
mhm.
maybe the last 3 years or something. So he's like you have your car on the driveway and you got the engine revved up and you're about to put it into gear. He's kind of
Susan
stuck
Lucci.
there.
Susan Lucci, was nominated forever for,
Yeah,
I mean, never got one until like, okay, fine, we're just going to give it to her.
yeah,
Is Andre Reed in terms of positions? Is Andre Reed?
yeah. Andre Reed there.
Forever? No, Tim Brown. Sorry, that's the one I'm
Yeah,
at.
yeah.
I think he was a finalist 9 times. Uh, Saying that, Tory, and I love Tory Holt, but Larry Fitzgerald's got the better resume, and he's now going to be on the ballot.
Yeah, so,
That's
he's in a tough
hurt, right?
spot. You know, there's been a wide receiver logjam that's come up a couple of times in the last decade, and the most recent one has emerged over the last 4 or 5 years, particularly, when you had Bruce and then you had a Holt, and then, excuse me, you have Reggie Wayne. Um,
There's the other big loser on all this, right?
and these receivers have sort of like and then we had Megatron come into queue and got elected, and then Andre Johnson shows up and gets elected. But the receivers have kind of been churning or churning and churning, and the voters have kind of worked it through. We really thought that it was going to be Holt's year. We're getting this in a second, but I think the numbers got him. Um, if this would have been class of 5, I think he would have gotten in.
I think
Um,
he
but he didn't.
gets in,
So
and either Vinatieri
yeah.
or Kuechly.
Oh yeah, I think if you we don't know the countdown, we don't know how many people. I mean, the 7 were advanced. We don't know how many votes every one of them got. All we know is 3 of them got 80%, or were advanced through a tiebreaker because the minimum is 3 moderns to be elected. We don't really know. My sense of it is exactly that. Again, we're just speculating here, but given what we know about the voters' interest in these candidates in the queue, the fact they how they would have moved through, yeah, whole. I think if we would have been looking at a situation under the previous rules where we would expect to see rubber stamp 80% for 5 people, he would have been one of those. But he also, and then you're pointing out a scenario that often finalists find themselves in is they get so far and then all of a sudden somebody comes on the ballot the next year and
Right.
leaps right over them. And we got a guy next year, folks, who's not only going to leap over Reggie Wayne, but he's unfortunately going to leapfrog over Holt. In fact, he's going to leapfrog over everybody else left from this ballot, and that's Larry Fitzgerald.
Yeah. And how do you dispute that?
You can't. I mean, because at that point they're both going to be finalists in the 15. Again, they're going to be presented. They're going to be debated, and people are going to look at those and say, "I got 2 guys. Well, the errors don't overlap exactly, but hey, they're both receivers. You know, we only have so many slots. It's not like they have quotas by position, but the reality is, if you're only going to elect 3 or 4 of these guys." You're not going to vote 2 guys who are receivers, nor would you
Unlikely. It's
2
possible,
others about, yeah, unlikely.
but
So yeah, it's going to be Holt's going to be in a holding pattern. He's going to need to see Fitzgerald go through, and in my projections, depending on whether it's 3 or 4, getting a slot for moderns in say 2027 or 2028, Holt's going to wait a bit longer, and he's going to look to be on the ballot longer. As you said, he's already been on for several years. He's just going to have to wait another year to be on next.
unfortunately, yeah.
Yeah.
So let's shift focus now to the seniors slash coaches slash contributors. And oh man, 1 out of 5.
It's a bloodbath.
It really is. So if you can just sort of like go through how that process works, and then we'll look at
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier, over the years, we've had different pathways, but there were direct pathways where you would have as many as 1 or 2, or in the last couple of years, 3 seniors. They would go in, they'd be finalists. They would get presented, discussed, not compete against one another, but they have each individually would be voted on. If they get 80%, they're in. The same for a coach and contributor, whether they were combined or separate, and it's usually 1 slot. We've been used to that for several years. But again, the pressure being that, well, these classes 2 years ago, this situation with the modern seniors, coaches, we got 9 people in the class of 2023, and I think combined with other classes that were 7 or 8 in the Centennial class, there was this pushback. At any rate, so that's why we end up now with these rules where, yeah, you have 5 finalists. They've come through an extensive long list through blue ribbon panels to 9 finalists for each one of them, and we had 3 finalists that could be put forth as seniors, and then we had a coach and we had a contributor. But the rule now is there are 5. They compete. They're all presented. They're separate from the moderns, but they're going to compete on each other. And the rules say, well, the minimum is 1, maximum is 3, and they have to reach that 80%. So, folks, if you're doing the math in your head, like I talked about earlier, 49 voters, 5 ballots. Yeah, maybe one guy clears the 40 or so, but what happens if we get, of these 5, 2 or 3 that each get 28, 32, whatever, and the votes get gobbled up, but nobody hits the 80%.
Mm.
And again, our good friend Jack Silverstein pointed this out, that it's bad for the moderns, and it could be really bad for this group of 5, the seniors, coach, and contributor. And we only got 1, which means only 1 of them got over the 80 votes across the 5
the one we would
ballots.
have thought.
Yeah.
If we thought they'd only pick 1, this is probably the guy they were going to do.
Well, yes, but we're going to talk about a guy who I think is is probably setting aside Eli Manning for a moment.
Yeah.
I think we have a guy we're going to talk about here in just a second who was probably from the omission side of things, not elected,
Mhm.
probably the biggest surprise that shocked people.
I'm curious if we're thinking about the same person, but
It's Mike Holmgren.
yes. Okay, we are. Yay.
Because there's one coach finalist.
Yeah.
So they've gone through a long list to get to one.
Mhm.
He's a guy who took a team to the Super Bowl, won a Super Bowl, took one franchise to two Super Bowls, and took a franchise to another, right?
Right.
So that's a pretty, and when you look at guys who are in the Hall of Fame in recent years, and there's been some debate about some of the coaches getting in, but the point is that bar, he clears it,
Mhm.
and yes, he's in the five, but we thought maybe he would collect enough of the 40 and the player we're going to talk about would, and that would leave the other guys out,
I guess if I
but it
thought they
didn't
were going to
happen.
pick one, I had Sharpe over Holmgren. If I thought Holmgren was getting in.
Well, it's fair enough because Sharpe's name has been up, talked about as a senior finalist for a while. He's been a finalist, but never presented, never made it this far,
Right.
and he probably has more of a history and more of a backing from the fan base and those who follow the Hall
Well,
than a Mike Holmgren does. So that kind of makes
sure.
sense that
And
he would have a higher profile.
even to your point, right? So like our friend Jack, Jack, you're getting a lot of love here on this show, man.
Yeah.
Uh, but Jack is a diehard Bears fan. Jeff Schlegel, another one of our in our group, is a diehard Bears fan. You want to hear two people who pounded the pavement for Sharpe? It's those two Bears
Yeah.
fans. And again, as a Saints guy, you're a Cowboys guy. You know who we were afraid of,
Yeah.
right? So Sharpe gets in. Sharpe and to echo something you said earlier, you were talking about Terrell Davis, Tony Baselli. Sharpe is that guy. Sterling Sharpe was that guy who was an injury away from being a modern Hall of Fame ballot.
Yeah, and we talked about him on our previous show where we highlighted the finalist, and I'll repeat what I said then. In the early 90s, at his peak, he was first team All Pro, I think 3 years in there, and he put up what, 3 seasons of 90 plus, and he he was second best. He was almost equal to, or a sliver the second best wide receiver in that era, behind the GOAT himself,
Right.
Jerry Rice. So come on, people. That the short career, yes, but that alone tells you, and the short career is what's made him wait. He never got in. He was actually never even discussed as a finalist as a modern. So the senior process saved him relatively quickly, but still, it's good to see him go in, well deserved, and he becomes right the first set of brothers to be in the Pro Football Hall of Fame.
No, I like it. I'm happy for him. So we have three people who did not advance. One we knew didn't have a shot in hell, and that's Ralph Hay. Ralph Hay is essentially the brainchild behind what is the National Football League, but the brevity of his career, 5 years as the owner of the Canton Bulldogs, and the fact that you have a lot of people, even the voters, like, who's Ralph Hay?
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
mean,
we've heard that in the past. We heard it publicly on a few occasions when he was announced as the contributor finalist over what many would view obviously a much more well-known, supported potential candidate who has been considered in recent years among the folks, among those to be advanced as a contributor finalist. And of course, that's the New England Patriots owner, Robert Kraft. And so we kind of got a hint early on when Hay was announced from the Blue Ribbon panel who selected the one contributor finalist for the meeting last month, that he was going to have a tough role for the very reason you described. And what he did was 100 years ago. And the reality is people were forgetting a lot of that history. The reality is the voters, the full panel, most of them started covering the NFL in the last, say, 20 years. A few of them are writers, historians, but they're really not. So some of them have a broader view. And I do want to acknowledge publicly, we called him out earlier, I'm going to do it again, is Clark Judge. Clark Judge has been a strong advocate for Ralph Hay when he was in the Centennial class semifinalist in 2020, but was not elected. He has been pushing his name hard to that committee and finally was able to get him into the room, as we say, as a fifth finalist and be presented and discussed for the very first time. It was a mountain to climb, but I want to publicly thank and acknowledge for those of us who understand and appreciate the long history of the NFL and the role that Ralph Hay played to take on that task. And I'm quite certain that he did a fantastic and passionate presentation. But the numbers, as we just described, and with this not a direct path, get 80% and you're in, you got to compete with four others, doomed Ralph Hay. And here's the saddest thing about this, Kurt, is his case is probably done, right? Because
I think so.
it's very hard for these blue ribbon panels every year to come up with a new set of finalists. Do you bring back somebody who the full selection committee didn't support and try it again, or do you have a queue of others that are also deserving that have never been presented? So last year we had two guys who didn't get elected. One was a coach in Buddy Parker, and then we had one senior in our pal. They made it. They were presented a year ago. They were not elected. They didn't make it very far to this year at all. So
I agree with you 100%. I think Ralph A will, I don't know when we'll see him again at this stage. And the same for the next person I'm going to bring up, Jim Tyrer. And one that you forward, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on his name, Tony Gross.
Yeah, from the beat writer from the Browns.
Yes, yeah. Sorry, apologies that I'm blanking on your name. I'm so sorry, because you, again, thank you for all that you've done. But he pretty much indicated that at the end of the day, what Jim Tyrer did, despite being arguably the best offensive lineman not in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, not arguably, I'll say it, he's the best offensive lineman not in the Pro Football Hall of Fame, who's eligible. CTE or not, you killed your wife and yourself. And that's a pretty hard obstacle to overcome.
Yeah, I mean, his on the field credentials were good enough that when he first became eligible as a modern finalist in the early 80s, he reached the final. He reached in that process fairly far.
That year.
That year.
And then he never
But
was.
unfortunately, the circumstance you just highlighted would follow. And with the murder of his wife and his own suicide, he just fell off, and his name never appeared on any kind of preliminary list as a modern. He never got any traction when his eligibility ended and he moved into senior pool. People were aware of him. Of course, for many decades, the senior selection was really just five guys getting together in a room and picking one or two finalists. It was done like that for decades. It's only been in the last few years that they actually went through a formal, larger committee of 12. It's now 9, but to have, and publicly list who the semifinalists and finalists are, and that's all new. But he never popped up anywhere on that process until this year.
Yeah.
Which suggests that there were senior members of the Blue Ribbon Panel, which is a different group of 7 plus 2 non-voters for the first time in that process for both the coaches, contributors, and seniors to have new insight from non-voters who are historians or writers that he got through. And that committee clearly felt we want him talked about. Well, they did. And of course, when he was nominated as a finalist, it got a lot of attention for the reasons. He's had advocates among his family, a journalist who did a documentary with his family, the whole issue mentioned about CTE and how we have to look at these folks differently than maybe we did in the past. But again, getting the analogy of trying to get a candidate over the top of the mountain when the mountain is very steep, this was gonna be a very, very tough case to bring to the voters. And they got him in the room. He was discussed.
Apparently
There's
one of the
controversy
longest.
all around this that we can get into here a little bit if people want to know,
Yeah.
leading up to this and in the meeting and what can and can't be said, was prop said. Um, and I suspect you're right. He got a shot, which is one step, but I can't foresee, given that we have a senior pool with several other at least deserving candidates, and we only got one elected this year. We're not going to get a bunch every year going forward. That
Yeah.
his case is going to move to the side or the back of the senior queue, or as I like to refer it to, there's so many in the deep part of the pool that we're unlikely to see him come up, be considered again. The voters,
Purgatory
full
now.
selection committee kind of made it clear they're
Yeah.
not interested.
Yeah, exactly. So that just leaves us with one person who unfortunately also failed. Maxie Baughn was an incredible Hall of Fame resume. I'd be very curious to see how he finished. I'm going to guess third.
Yeah, and, for our viewers, we don't know because none of this is, even the voters are never told the vote counts
Right.
or not. In this case, all they knew was the five were presented, including Maxie Baughn. They were all presented, discussed, and then they handed in a ballot with up to three names and 80%, a minimum one of three. They don't know how it ranked out. We don't know who finished. Well, we know who finished with the most votes.
Yeah,
That
we know
was Shannon.
first.
That was Sharpe. But for the other four, we don't know. But I'm guessing, it was a tough vote split, and he may have fared a little bit better than Hay, I suspect. Maybe probably better than Tyler did, but it wasn't
That'd
enough.
be my guess. That's why I thought third.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I'd have, if I were to guess,
I
home.
think you're right. He has that strong case, and again, if the seniors had a direct path to election, which they've had for many years prior to this, where you present them and they're up yes or no, and they don't compete against anybody,
Mhm.
like we would have had, a couple years ago when three seniors, including Chuck Howley, were elected, and then last year when two out of three seniors were elected, Steve McMichael and of course Randy Gradishar. I really thought that was setting the path. If the rules would have stayed the same for a direct election of senior, that Maxie Baughn was the next guy up because he's a linebacker from an overlap era of both Chuck Howley and Randy Gradishar. And I suspect for a number of years the logjam was there.
Yeah.
And then we got Howley elected 2 years ago as a senior linebacker. And then we got Randy Gradishar, two very deserving and been waiting for decades. And I think we felt that, okay, Maxie's the next guy up because you mentioned very strong criteria. And we have the other two linebackers from the 60s and 70s out of the queue and elected. He should have been the next one up, but he didn't get the numbers. And again, I don't know whether we will see him come back up
Hmm.
if we continue with this model where you have three seniors recommended as finalists. I don't know whether we see his name come up.
I think
And
we
he passed
will.
away, unfortunately. So it's terrible for his family to have to go through the unknown
There were
uncertainty.
death
He's
punch,
not
right?
elected. So.
Yeah, and that's what I think we see for a lot of these guys. It's great. The transparency is fantastic unless you're that much in the weeds, right? So, we sort of like talked about Willie Anderson, sort of like direct corresponds on this, and sort of like you could see I don't know if you could see the hurt, but I mean, like, I guess, you're not tweeting me about it and saying, yeah, this is, it's agreeing with my take. Tory Holt, it's sometimes it's not even the case of the people, and I sometimes I joke about Jennifer Matthews, Clay Matthews' daughter, only because I don't think she does a very good Hall of Fame case for her dad, but whatever. It means more to probably the family around. When I talked to George Kuntz's son, I know how much it meant to him. I don't know how much it meant to George. When I talked to Jerry Kramer's daughter some time ago, and she was kind enough to actually set me up with an interview with Jerry Kramer, which was something I did maybe 10 years ago. I don't know. Before I even recorded all these things, I wish I had recorded it. And she was crying on the phone when I was talking to her because it meant that much.
Yeah.
So, and some of these guys, the Hall of Fame means a lot. Some of it, they don't, it's like,
Yeah, well, if you think about it, after decades past retirement, and they have not been elected. There probably gets to a point, years later, and you get older in life, and you're in your 60s or 70s or 80s, and you reach you sort of reach a point where you're satisfied with your life and your accomplishments and the honors that you received. And it's not that it doesn't matter as much, but you sort of accepted how your career has been acknowledged, right?
Hmm?
And the Professional Football Hall of Fame just didn't happen. And it may not. And so you move on. But for your family, and then unfortunately, in the case of Chuck Howley 2 years ago, was elected after almost 40 years of waiting. And fortunately, over the last decade, Chuck Howley has had dementia,
He's
and
still alive, right?
he's still alive. Yep. And but he's gotten, and my frustration was there were many years I think he could have been elected, would have been a fine senior finalist elected a
Enjoy
decade
it.
ago when his memory and his acuteness awareness would have been a bit better. But unfortunately,
Yeah.
yeah, he was not. I mean, some awareness. They did as best as they could, acknowledge and represent. He didn't come to ceremony in 2023. Getting back to your point, as much as he may or may not have appreciated, his family certainly did. And that's something maybe we need to keep in mind. And we're not suggesting there be any kind of process or rules for this, but it's just unfortunate. We're losing more
Fair.
and more of these guys. Eddie Meter is gone. He died a couple of years ago, right around election time. He was a semifinalist,
Oh, for the seniors, yeah,
considered
yeah.
in the past. We just talked about Maxie Baughn. These guys, and there are still some and I think one of the youngest ones who has been a senior semifinalist but hasn't quite made a finalist, and he's one of the youngest one is former Cincinnati Bengals quarterback Ken Anderson. He ain't getting any younger. I
Yeah, and
don't
that's
hold me. He's in his 70s. Maybe he's even 80 by now. Certainly in his 70s.
I don't know.
Um,
Yeah, he hasn't.
so another factor that, again, I'm not suggesting it comes into play, but it is an outcome,
Right? I mean,
unfortunately,
look at
from
Steve
this.
McMichael. If Steve,
Yeah.
I'm sure there were a few people who voted for him so that he could see it. I don't
Yeah.
know for sure, and I feel like I'm dragging Mongo, and I don't mean to be
No,
saying,
I don't think anybody is, but we mentioned it at the time and we mentioned earlier. I mean, emotion plays a
yeah,
part of this. You got in this case, you got 49 voters on a Zoom call, and it was the same a year ago, and they're talking about these guys. They know who Steve McNichol is. They know his qualifications. Some of
right.
them covered him in the game. They know the support from his family and his friends and his former teammates and from the Bears organization. And we talked about this. You can't avoid in seeing what has happened to him and that terrible, terrible disease that's taking him away from us way too early and in a terrible manner and not be affected by that and say, hey, a year ago he's on that ballot, he's being presented. You can't ignore the fact that emotion moves people to say, yeah, I'm gonna elect him. And
Yeah,
that year he was one of three. He needed 80%. He got it. He's elected, and we were there. We
we were
saw
there.
we were there. We saw he wasn't attending the ceremony last year, but he was there in spirit. And there they did a bedside kind of um, ceremony for him with his family and his wife and his teammates. So kudos to all that. But it gets back to emotion on both sides, the voters and then the candidates and their families, it's an underlying influence factor that just exists. We're all human.
Absolutely. It's always humans voting on humans. Uh, Thank you, Paul, for making the time out of your schedule to sort of
Well,
take.
did we want to kind of tease what's coming next year?
Please. Oh,
Yeah, so
on
again,
my side?
congratulations. There's all four of the bus there behind me. For all four that we talked about that were elected to the class and was announced last night. So do we want to get a team? So we've talked kind of about the
Yeah,
key
yeah. That's it. Say
the
the big
folks who were
names that are coming
left.
out.
Yeah, so we've got these folks we mentioned that are left, and we pointed out the rules allow the four of them, Anderson, Holt, Luke Kuechly, and Vinatieri, automatically become among the 15 finalists next year. So they're in that queue. But boy, oh boy, first ballot joining that queue, and there are several here that not only will be semifinalists, I think there's going to be three or four of these guys pushing into the final 15, which might push out a few of the guys we mentioned earlier that were in the especially the 11 to 15 range this year. It could be a tight fit. So, from the top of this list, we've mentioned two of them. Quarterback, Brees. We have a whole year to talk about him. Maybe we don't need
I
to.
don't think we
He's a
need
Hall
to.
of Famer.
Yep.
There we go. He's getting in next year. We talked about Larry Fitzgerald. Yeah, we're probably talking about him in the next year. But again, welcome to the class of 2026. If we could do that, we would. But hey, but it doesn't stop there. You've got quarterback Philip Rivers. You got tight end Jason Witten. You got running back Frank Gore. And there are a few others, but the ones I just mentioned and they're not all going to get elected. We talked about the numbers and processes, but these are all, these five are serious contenders to be in that 15 finalist, which means that group we talked about earlier that were the 11 to 15 this year, the Eli, the Stephen Smith, the Suggs, the Fred Taylor, the Reggie Wayne, there aren't allowed to be ties at that anymore of that process. So we're going to see some shifting there of those folks that maybe were in that queue but are going to move back and stay in the semifinalist round and not, because we're not suggesting all four of the five guys I mentioned are going to be first ballot in. I told you two of them will be,
Yeah.
but the rest of them are going to be on that ballot. And
Someone's
what
got
happened this year, the rules, I mean, there's been a lot of pressure already since the announcement from voters that the Hall overcorrected and that a class of only 3 moderns and 1 senior coach contributor, this is the smallest class we've had in 20 years.
Yeah.
We've had a lot of classes of 6, but in more recent years, 7, 8, as I mentioned before, and 9 2 years ago. Maybe that's too big. The pendulum, the self-correction by the Hall, by criticism by Dion and others that the Hall was getting too big and not exclusive, might have went too far. I suspect, I don't know whether it's going to happen for 2026, maybe beyond that there are vocal voters behind the scenes who are going to go to the Hall and say, we need to tweak this. The minimum of 3 maybe needs to be moved up of 3 moderns, but I'm not suggesting we're going to see that. But my point is, under the current rules, how do these things look? Well, let me just quickly run through just a hypothetical, right? Just throwing some names out here. So yeah, we could have a class, next year where again, if there's only 3, because the math, it worked out that this year, and that's kind of how it looks. 4 is a bit tougher in the current math. Is we could have a class next year of Brees, Larry Fitzgerald, and let's just say Luke Kuechly. That's 3. That's it out of the 15, including the guys I just mentioned. Yeah. And then you go ahead another year and you're looking at 2027, where you have Ben Roethlisberger, Gronk, Gronkowski, and Adrian Peterson are all first ballot. Those 3 are all going to be in the mix. Yeah. I'm not saying they're all going to be first class, first year ballot elected in 2027, but they're going to be in that mix. And then you think, okay, things must get easier. 2028, Tom Brady, J.J. Watt, see ya, hello.
I need more information on Tom Brady. I don't know. I need to hear more about that.
And then 2029, you've got Aaron Donald and Jason Kelce. There are some other names mixed in there, like a Richard Sherman and a few others didn't point out. And again, the order might mix, but just if you look at the fact that we're only electing 3, if that doesn't change and the math doesn't allow us to think maybe and rethink things where we're maybe doing even 4 a year would help move things along. Look at what I just mentioned. My point here is if you're a finalist in the 15 this year, and you're in that queue, maybe if you're in the 8 to 10, or even in that 4 to 7 that weren't elected, you've got pathways. But compared to what we've seen in the last, say, decade, where maybe some of these guys would get in 2, 3, 4 years, we're not electing 5 anymore a year. The cumulative impact means some of these guys that we've talked about that were in the finalists this year, plus the ones that are coming in the next 4 years, some of these guys are going to wait even longer.
Absolutely.
And that's just going to be a tough haul.
Course correction.
Like Holt and Woodson and Willie Anderson are just 3 examples I give. They're in a queue, they're in the path, but their ability to get in, if we're only electing 3 per year, suddenly got a lot harder, unless the Hall changes to allow 4. And it may seem like 1 doesn't make a difference, but it adds up over these years in
Totally
terms
does.
of pathways.
Totally does. I do, because I guess I'm the eternal optimist here. I do believe that the Hall's going to course correct. Uh, I maybe because what they committed to this for 3 years, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, that's typically when they do these rule changes. It's sort of they pilot them, and so that might I have to go back and look, but you're probably right.
Hmm.
I think they're getting a lot of heat from some of the voters. There's some comments been made by some we mentioned earlier in the show. They've been very professional about it, but they pointed out, hey, the Hall board has overcorrected, and this we don't this is it's maybe we don't need 7 or 8 people elected, but 4 means we're making deserving people waiting and we're cutting off pathways, and that's an overcorrection. So I do tend to agree with you. I don't know when the board meets first week in every August to do business. They may be presented this year with a proposal from the staff to say, okay, let's tweak it. It could be as simple as modern modern max or sorry modern minimum is moved from 3 to 4 and
Or
starting
80 to
class 2026.
70%. Well, like one of those things. Hell, even my mock committee, every 3 years, we put it to a vote to change things and never
So
change it.
we don't know, but we have a strong sense that the board is going to
Well,
realize
here's
their error
here's how
and
we'll
make a
know
fix.
if they do it. If because you told you, I hope you don't mind me saying this. You messaged me and said, "I guess I'm not seeing you in Canton next year. I'm not going."
Yeah.
So, and you're like me. Well, you're a Cowboys person, but you're going regardless usually. So you're not going to be there. There might be other people who are going to take the same stance that you did, and we noticed there were some empty seats there. You wouldn't, if you were watching it on TV, you wouldn't notice that, but there was. So if you,
Yeah, I mean it's kind of an interesting thing because the Enshrinement Week is a whole bunch of activities, including the gaming enshrinement. There are a lot of ticketed events. So the number of people who come out and attend and pay for these events, plus put money into the local community by going out to bars and restaurants and have hotel rooms, you
don't
know,
know that great breakfast place we went to.
yeah, things like that. I mean, and every year it bounces around because headliners will bring bigger crowds. Makes sense. So some of that's coming up with some of the names I mentioned. I mean, you're going to get a big turnout for Brees and Gronk and Brad, Tom Brady and others. And when Bill Belichick becomes eligible next year as a coach, and so that's going to happen. But it is interesting to me that the Hall and the Enshrinement Week is such a key source of revenue for them as an entity, and they're standalone. They're not financed by the league. They're a nonprofit. That they haven't really thought through. Wait a minute, if we only elect four people
Yeah.
and it's not 5, 6, or 7, then the fans of those teams and the players that aren't elected are going to be less willing and able and interested to come. That has to be in their mind, if not already. It should have been. It will be. It's got to impact their revenue. It just makes sense. Fewer people enshrined will bring fewer crowds. It's just how it's going to work. And they may realize, wait a minute, whoa, we did really go too far with our efforts to make the classes smaller because people like Dion bitched about it publicly. He wasn't the only one, but he was one of the more vocal ones that said it
Most
publicly.
local, and he's got a pretty big platform.
Well, huge, yeah, huge platform.
I mean,
So,
an eventual
I mean,
NFL
I'm not
coach.
going out of any kind of like financial protest, but a smaller class is less interest to me. I'm not dismissing these 4, but it's just something that's not of interest to me. It doesn't make as much a big of an
Working
event.
class, right? It's like, am I going to spend that kind of money that I invest every year for something where I'm just seeing 4 presentations as opposed to 7?
Yeah.
Not none of whom are sort of tied with my fan base either.
Yeah, so you've got that factor, plus there's less of them. And whether it's going to the hall or going to one of the events or autograph sessions or the enshrinement or the gold jacket event, these are all ticketed paid events. And you're right. Smaller class, they're great for great individuals, but it's not going to be the same draw when you had 6 or 7, 8, 9, 6 and 7, and it would help. I'm kind of surprised that the hall hasn't thought that through. If they haven't, they're going to find out, I suspect.
Maybe they didn't. Like, who knows? So like, we, like I look at halls, like all the halls, like the Hockey Hall of Fame doesn't seem to have to care, which is good for them, I guess. So like I don't think they're too worried because they've got X amount of space. They're not going to expand. They can't unless they move to a completely different facility. And I don't think they need to, and I don't think they want to.
No, I mean it's a if you've never been there, folks, if you're a hockey fan, it is a beautiful facility in an old bank that they renovated in downtown Toronto. It is an incredible building. They do a fantastic job with the amount of materials and artifacts and how they present the history of hockey. It is fantastic, but you're absolutely right. I don't think the draw there necessarily is, well, we've added these new players in. Certainly that would. It's a tourist attraction for people who are in Toronto, and Toronto's a hockey city.
Right.
So they probably have all that built, or this is kind of what our revenue looks like and our expenses. Whereas Canton is a seasonal town. Yeah, there's independent corporations that's created the Hall Village. The Hall is part, but separate from that. The Village is having, and has for many years, economic or financial challenges trying to grow and expand, but that's a whole other story. But the community of Canton and the Hall itself really do rely on the Enshrinement, and it is a week of events to draw in thousands and thousands of fans for the game and the Enshrinement and everything else. But a smaller class, even with a good headliner, I'm sure the Packers fans will be there and the Chargers fans, but it's just less of a draw.
The Chargers don't have a huge fan base.
Well, I didn't want to pick on them, but yeah, but you're right. The reality is, we all know this. I mean, there are certain fan bases that travel, and some don't. So
I was going to say, to be fair, I was shocked last year by the great support that Andre Johnson had from the Texans fan.
Yeah,
and kudos to.
Yeah, I mean, if you're a fan and you go to games, you know which fan bases will travel, and it's not all 32 teams.
I wonder if Marianne Doe will be there. She went viral as a Chargers fan.
Who knows?
And she's an Asian woman. My wife's an Asian woman. I pointed to her and said, like, why can't you be more like that when I watch football? She didn't like that.
No, I
go over too well.
So it will be interesting to see the response they're getting, the pressure they get from voters, from fan bases, those of us in the media, them in the media, and the rest of us who follow the Hall,
public figures,
about the course adjustment they might need to make, and the financial implications of what they're going to experience. Not by a formal protest, but as we said, fewer people.
It's interesting.
Fewer fans, fewer enshrinees. I mean, a couple of headliners, but not big enough to make up for that. I mean, I'm quite certain in 2026 the Saints Nation will swarm in. I'm not being kidding here. They will swarm into Canton for Drew Brees. Why? Because they have very few Hall of Famers, and he is beloved in that town and in that franchise. And they will be out in mass. So I have no doubt about that a year from now. This year, I don't know. Doesn't seem to be the same formula.
We'll see. We will see. Paul, thank you so much for making the time to do this. This meant a lot to me. Check out all the other shows here we do at Not in Hall of Fame. If you want to be interested in more Hall of Fame related shows, hey, that's what I do. Also, too, sometimes I sort of like go a little bit beyond the grain with some of the programs that we have. Also, check out notinhalloffame.com, the site. A lot of updates coming. Hopefully in the next 30 days, I will have the baseball and football list revised as we're sort of adding new names and taking some off. Wherever you are, wherever you may be, make today count because it never comes again. Take care.